YouTube's algorithm decided to throw me a curveball not too long ago and recommend this video by Christian apologist Sean McDowell. In the video, Sean visits an apologetics class at a Christian high school, but instead of speaking as himself, he introduces himself as an atheist and answers the students' questions as an atheist for nearly an hour before finally revealing his true identity. By the time I reached the end, I felt the need to speak out on it. I quickly messaged my friend Paul of the YouTube channel Apologia about it, as I think he's probably the best counter-apologetics YouTuber on the platform, and his thinking on the video was similar to my own.
Among the Christians I've seen attempt to roleplay as atheists, Sean is probably the best at it. Kudos to Sean for having internalized, to some degree, objections to his faith that he has heard in his conversational travels. A Christian was able to successfully pose as an atheist for an hour, but was Sean
so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should?
Like trying to become the world's best live grenade juggler? Some activities are gonna hurt people in the practice and have disproportionate dangers, even if mastered.
Exactly. This is not a practice which I think is appropriate, and we'll soon get into why, but first let me explain all the moving parts here. As I said, in this video, Sean posed as an atheist and did a Q&A with students for a while, then revealed his identity and spoke with them a bit more. Sean then made a follow-up debrief video where he briefly responded as an apologist to the answers and arguments he gave while in his atheist character. Paul and I are going to respond to just a few parts of Sean's atheist Q&A, occasionally referencing Sean's remarks post-identity reveal, as well as his follow-up video. Then I'll give my thoughts on this event overall. Links to both of Sean's videos will be in the description if you'd like to see if our editing represents Sean's words fairly. With all that said, let's jump into Sean's Q&A video.
Recently, I was asked to do my atheist roleplay at a private Christian school in Florida. Now, normally audiences know that I'm just role-playing and that I'm really a Christian professor and apologist. But in this case, the Bible teacher insisted that he actually tell them that I'm a real atheist and that I went along with it. He didn't think most of them would recognize me. A few did, but they didn't blow my cover. Now, if you're an atheist and you're watching this, I hope you realize that I aim to give an atheist defense as clearly as I can. I try not to set up a straw man. She might answer some questions differently than me, but I think you'll find that I'm trying to fairly represent atheism.
I'm bringing my friend Sean up to speak today. He's got his PhD in philosophy, and he teaches out in California at UCLA. And he had told me a while back that he was going to be here in Florida for a convention of philosophy at UM. And I thought if you could come by and pretty much do what I do to you guys every week in apologetics class, and just press you on what you believe and why you believe it. But this time it's not just going to be someone pretending.
At this point, Sean introduces himself and tells a brief story about how he was raised as a Christian, but as he grew up and went to a secular university, he encountered new perspectives which made him question his faith.
To make a long story short, after I started to read people of different worldviews, I came to the conclusion there's no good scientific evidence that God exists. There's no reason to think the Bible is true, let alone inspired. I mean, there's far too many contradictions and errors and mistakes in the Bible. Not to mention things like misogyny and slavery and genocide to come from a holy God. And frankly, I'm not sure Jesus existed. He might have. But I think the Christian story is better explained as being patterned after these dying and rising gods of the ancient Near East. So I became an atheist.
He's also careful to steer clear of the stereotype of the angry, bitter atheist who left Christianity loudly with no negative social consequences, which is an image Christians often perpetuate. This is refreshing to see, at least.
But you could probably imagine if you stopped believing the things your parents and community believed, that would upset the apple cart, wouldn't it? Like, it wasn't easy to start telling people, hey, I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist. Many were disappointed in me. Many thought like they had failed certain things. And I said, look, it's not your fault, Mom and Dad. I didn't blame my Bible teachers. I just have to follow what's true. And I don't think Christianity's true.
There's a bit more to his introduction, but for the sake of time, let's move on to the first question.
Hi. So you like to talk about philosophical arguments, correct? So I would like to know what you think about the world and its creation as a whole philosophically, and how the world, if it's so fine-tuned to its creation, how something bigger or outside didn't create it.
Okay, so let me jump in. So one is the question of, say, the origin of the universe creation. Now, I don't think the universe was created. I don't believe in creation because that word implies a creator and a mind. That's the very thing I'm not convinced that actually exists. So I actually think the data shows while our universe had a beginning, when you look at string theory, you'll find what's called the multiverse. And if you're following the shows like WandaVision and The Flash, like they toy in the multiverse in science fiction, but there's actually good reason to believe. Sorry if I ruined it for some of you. Too bad. You had time. The multiverse, I think string theory points towards that reality. So our universe had a beginning, but I don't think the multiverse did. It's eternal and it's always been here. And there's reasons for that we could go into.
It's telling that Sean's atheist character defends his atheist position by using the multiverse hypothesis to first negate the proposition that the universe had a beginning, even though the beginning of the universe didn't seem to be a focus of the student's question. Christian Sean, like most Christian apologists, believe that the cosmological argument constitutes good evidence for a creator.
Number one is the universe had a beginning. We know this now from science, we know this from philosophy, that the universe began to exist. It's not eternal. Therefore, there must be a cause outside of the universe that's personal and powerful and intelligent, spaceless and timeless. That sounds a lot like God. The beginning of the universe points towards a beginner.
Sean's atheist character seems to think it's necessary to undermine the idea that the universe had a beginning because he thinks the cosmological argument is valid and therefore he couldn't be an atheist if he believed the universe had a beginning. Even while playing atheist Sean still reasons, naturally, like Christian Sean. An atheist myself, I don't think the cosmological argument constitutes evidence of a creator, so I have no ideological reason to undermine the proposition that the universe had a beginning. If I were to guess which position on this argument better represents more atheists, it wouldn't be atheist Sean's.
Fine-tuning, if this were the only universe that existed, then I think we would be surprised that it happens to be so seemingly exquisitely fine-tuned to allow life. But since it's not, and there's more probabilistic resources in the universe, I don't see why fine-tuning is a problem. In fact, if there is a multiverse, we wouldn't expect to find ourselves in a universe that's not fine-tuned because we couldn't live in such a universe. We'd expect to find ourselves in the very kind of universe that we do find ourselves in.
Personally, I don't think upholding the multiverse hypothesis is a good counter to the argument from fine-tuning, as it replaces one untestable, unfalsifiable hypothesis, God, with another untestable, unfalsifiable hypothesis, the multiverse. In fact, I have a nearly 3-year-old video on my channel discussing this. I'd respond instead by saying that the fine-tuning argument assumes that the physical constants of our universe are unlikely, then builds its case from there. This has not been demonstrated, though, as we have no data from which we can determine the probability of these constants being as they are. We've only ever observed one set of constants and have no reason to think they're likely or unlikely. We simply don't know whether they're likely or not, so this unsupported notion that they're unlikely doesn't lend any support to either the multiverse or God. The larger problem with atheist Sean's response, though, becomes apparent upon listening to a later segment of this video where Christian Sean explains how this atheist answer of his was formulated.
So you were talking about like the whole science-y stuff about the multiverse and all of this like stuff, which is like I couldn't even understand it. I was able to.
It's fine
because it was just too much. So why would somebody believe all of that if they just? Is it easier for them than believing in a God because like they're guilty? Or
Okay, so let me make 2 points here. Number one, you might have noticed sometimes instead of answering a question, I was like, string theory, multiverse, complex words act as if you answer something but really didn't. I played that card a few times.
Sean's multiverse answer was admittedly just word salad. It wasn't supposed to provide an answer to the question, it was meant to confuse the student and distract from the question. This brings 2 questions to my mind. One, does Sean not understand the logic of the multiverse hypothesis being used as an alternative to the God hypothesis in relation to fine-tuning? Does he think that when people, however incorrect both Sean and I think they are, invoke the multiverse, they're simply using big sciencey words to confuse Christians? I highly doubt that's the case, but that's the impression this gives the viewer. Two, and much more importantly, does Christian Sean think he's representing atheists well without strawmanning by having Atheist Sean, a supposed philosophy professor from UCLA, just use word salad to get out of having to contend with an incredibly common philosophical argument? Does he think that atheists, even those of Atheist Sean's supposed caliber, are so unable to respond to this argument that they have to resort to deceit and distraction when faced with it? While I can't say I know the answer to that, I think a more charitable interpretation of this is that since Atheist Sean is only Christian Sean in disguise, he can't always answer the student's question like an actual atheist might. He's only capable of answering it in a way which allows Christian Sean to quickly debunk his answer. After all, if Christian Sean couldn't readily contend with Atheist Sean's points, Sean might actually become an atheist. For the next question we'll address, I'm going to hand it over to Apologia.
One student seemed particularly frustrated with Sean's ambivalence toward whether Jesus was a historical person or not.
No, so the Roman saying Jesus existed and Jesus was a person.
Well, there's no good early Roman source that does.
Josephus.
Josephus was Jewish, for one.
He was a Roman historian,
Second, he was writing for Rome, but he was not Roman. Josephus was
That's my
Jewish.
mistake.
The student isn't wrong here, but he isn't 100% correct either. Atheist Sean pounces on this.
Josephus mentions 33 people by the name of Jesus. 33 people.
I'm not sure where Sean is getting the very specific number of 33 that he's putting forth twice. It's possible there's an obscure academic source that affirms this, but my best efforts can't find it. Jewish Christian historian Paul Winter says that Josephus mentions about 12 individuals named Jesus, and Louis H. Feldman puts the number at 21. The kernel of truth is that historian Josephus does mention multiple individuals named Jesus. I understand that Atheist Sean would have wanted to project confidence as part of the roleplay. My concern is that Sean's performance may be creating an impression that putting forth false scholarship is a characteristic typical of non-believers.
Have you read the Antiquities of the Jews?
I've not read that yet.
Okay, so listen, that's all right. I would encourage you to read it.
Antiquities of the Jews consists of 20 volumes and was written in Greek. It's possible that Sean has read all the volumes cover to cover, but I doubt it. Whether he has or hasn't, his character is attempting to assert scholarly dominance here and press a power disparity. Demanding the reading of 20 volumes in order to discuss a single passage is an unreasonable prerequisite and unnecessarily causes the student to feel small in this interaction.
It's like saying somebody referred to Mike or John today. Jesus was a very common name in the Jewish world because it refers to Joshua, like a savior. So yeah, he refers to a bunch of people by the name of Jesus, but that's hardly reference to the historical biblical Jesus.
This is a disingenuous non sequitur because Christians don't put forth all the dozens of Josephus passages about ambiguous common name Jesus as evidence for the Jesus of the Bible. There are two specific passages in question, and both are unambiguous. This is the weakest possible objection, one I've not even heard before, and Sean starts with it, implying it's the best.
Second reason I don't trust Josephus is in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 18.
It's actually chapter 3 of book 18. Now, I'm terrible with references on the spot and make reference mistakes in live discussions all the time, including in my live conversation with Sean where he was very generous. If it's a slip, it's an understandable slip, but it unfortunately falls into one of the ethical pitfalls of this exercise of inadvertently characterizing atheists as confidently imprecise.
Josephus is not quoted for the first 8 centuries of the church. It's not really the 10th century that any church historian quotes Josephus.
Atheist Sean is wrong again here. as Church Father Eusebius quotes this Josephus passage at least 3 times in the 4th century, not the 10th century. I'm not sure if Christian history expert Sean was remembering that.
Because the passage that allegedly refers to Jesus was tweaked and interpolated and not actually written by Josephus.
And we finally arrived at the core of the argument. Virtually all historians agree that the passage was embellished, if not outright invented, by later Christians. In his debrief video, Christian Sean affirms this.
Now, we won't enter into that debate here, but many scholars agree that that passage was interpolated or adapted later on.
And then cites the second passage that isn't as friendly to a purely mythicist cause.
But a passage that's not disputed, as far as I could tell, in my doctoral research on James, the brother of Jesus, is the passage in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 20. The reason it seems largely undisputed is that there's really a political debacle going on, and Ananias kind of seizes authority, and it literally just mentions that James, the brother of Jesus the Christ, was put to death, and then it moves on.
Christian Sean says that we can be confident in this passage since it's not religious. There's really a political debate going on. That's very interesting to me, because I have argued with Sean that the political nature of James's death disqualifies his martyrdom as any kind of guarantee of the truth of Jesus' resurrection. James died for politics, not ideology.
Apology wants to say that the death of James was political murder, not ideological. But it's not that simple.
It seems inconsistent to call the murder political when arguing Jesus' historicity, and ideological when arguing martyrdom.
Yeah. Hey, good question. That's okay. I appreciate your thinking. You guys are wrestling with these ideas here. I commend you for that.
I think this was well-meaning, but with the apparent frustration of the student, there's a danger this conversation ended on inferred condescension, further poisoning the well.
See how when you're responsible for properly representing individuals which you don't represent in reality, especially in a context where those individuals are outsiders under extreme scrutiny, any miscalculation or error on your part could negatively color the audience's image of those you're trying to represent? Yeah, that's the high-risk juggling act Paul mentioned. Except if Sean makes a mistake, it's not Sean who reaps the consequences. It's the atheists which these students encounter in the future. Some of those atheists might even be in that class. All right, skipping ahead a bit to a question about consciousness.
You noted that the multiverse had to be an eternal type thing in order for the beginning of our universe to be created. So, going off of that, do you believe that the components of something created needs to be in that which created it? So like, for example, with the creation of our world, we have intellectual minds. And from that, with the multiverse, how did the intellectual minds come, like, initiate or develop through something that didn't have that property?
Okay, so if I understand, you're asking the question of consciousness. How did a universe that seemingly at the beginning was physical do things like minds emerge through that process?
Yes.
Did I capture your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yes, the universe is physical. Wait, don't leave yet, because she might want to follow up. But there's certain capacities for what are called emergent properties at the right level of complexity and diversity to emerge. So take, for example, hydrogen and oxygen. They're two physical molecules or elements. You put them together and you have water. Now, a new property emerges called wetness. It doesn't exist just in hydrogen, doesn't exist just in oxygen, but somehow when these two physical properties emerge, these two elements emerge, you have this new property develop out of it. Well, I think the same is true when it comes to the emergence of consciousness, that at a certain level of complexity, this new element, it's an epiphenomenon of consciousness, emerges like wetness. And what's interesting is you look throughout the evolutionary history of our world, and you can see simpler organisms aren't really conscious, but there's a basic awareness of pain. And then you have consciousness, and then you have self-consciousness. You have this increasing complexity go on as the evolutionary story unfolds.
Now, while I wouldn't call an emergent property of water wetness, I actually think atheist Sean's answer here is a good response to the question of whether or not parts which lack a certain property can combine or interact to make up something larger which does have that property. I think Christian Sean and I would probably agree on that. I also think that he and I would agree that citing emergent properties doesn't definitively explain the emergence of so-called consciousness. That's a testable hypothesis with some evidential support, but we can't say it's been definitively confirmed. The larger problem with atheist Sean's answer here is revealed upon examining Christian Sean's later explanation of the answer.
The third question that came up was a wonderful question. How in kind of a physical universe do minds and consciousness emerge? This was one of the best questions that a student asked. Why? Because the bottom line is there is no naturalistic explanation that can explain how dead matter can spawn a thinking, self-reflective, conscious being. There's none. I studied this in my master's program, and we looked at all sorts of different theories for explaining consciousness. Many will just go one route by saying they're agnostic. They concede there's no explanation. Others will just get rid of consciousness entirely. People like atheist Daniel Dennett take what's called more of an eliminativist position. But of course, if you get rid of consciousness, you get rid of thoughts, you get rid of free will, you get rid of anything material tied to what it means to be human, which raises a whole host of other problems. So bottom line, I think any honest atheist or naturalist would say, at least minimally, they don't know the mechanism of how consciousness or mind can emerge from matter. But this actually isn't a problem for a Christian or theistic worldview, because God, who is a mind, exists before matter. We are made body and soul, mind and matter. So it makes sense, if God is spirit, that we would be beings with spirit. So an argument actually can be made from the existence of the soul to the existence of God.
Christian Sean acknowledges that there are many people, presumably he's referring to atheists, who say they don't have a full explanation for consciousness.
Many will just go one route by saying they're agnostic. They concede there's no explanation.
He also says he thinks any honest atheist would say as much.
Bottom line, I think any honest atheist or naturalist would say, at least minimally, they don't know the mechanism of how consciousness or mind can emerge from matter.
So if Christian Sean was attempting to represent atheists fairly, without strawmanning, why did he have atheist Sean give an answer which was admittedly dishonest, rather than having him give one which Christian Sean himself has heard atheists give? If he needs help putting that atheist answer into words for his character, might I suggest that he take from a video I released over a month ago where I addressed an extremely similar question? Just replace the laws of nature with emergent properties and theoretical physicist with neuroscientist here, and the answer works well. If I'm getting this right, he says that citing the laws of nature to answer his question of how simple inanimate particles can produce complex and even conscious beings like humans is inadequate because it doesn't explain why those laws exist or how they remain in effect. So his gotcha question for atheists might now be restated as, how do you explain the existence of the laws of nature? This is a profound question, one I don't take lightly. It's one which our greatest scientific minds are only beginning to work on. Because we still have so much to learn, because we openly admit our ignorance in the absence of compelling evidence, the honest answer that I, as well as any theoretical physicist actually working on this problem, must give is, I don't know. Wait, so does that mean that he just asked a question which atheists can't answer? Actually, yes, because no one can give a verifiable answer to this question. See, I don't have an answer to this question, and the host of this video says he does. But give me just a moment, and I think I can explain why positing an answer like God did it doesn't actually further our understanding of the issue at all. This question highlights a gap in our knowledge about the universe. Citing this ignorance alone, the host of this video says that God must be the answer. This, again, is just a God of the gaps. It's the argument that because a verifiable answer hasn't been provided, we're justified in assuming that God is the answer. Again, I don't know that Christian Sean was trying to give the impression that atheists just lie when faced with simple apologetics, but when he once again admits that atheist Sean wasn't being honest, that's the picture this paints. Now back to Paul for a question about prophecy.
By now you've got a flavor of how the session went down, so we can cut to the chase a bit on the student who fumbled a little on formulating a question about prophecy.
So if the Bible contains hundreds of prophecies fulfilled after they were written, even being fulfilled like as of now in the 21st century.
An atheist Sean eventually got the conversation narrowed down to virgin birth prophecy.
That prophecy was written, according to you, before Jesus came on the scene in the book of Micah, correct?
I believe so.
It is correct.
Slight arrogance aside, atheist Sean is doing a good job getting to the criteria that would make something a good candidate for supernatural prophecy. Number 1, made clearly and demonstrably prior to the events predicted. Number 2, intended to be a prediction. Number 3, a non-mundane claim. Number 4, answerable only by a single, clear, verifiable occurrence. Number 5, not open to interpretation. And number 6, not something people are actively attempting to fulfill. The Micah passage was clearly written before Jesus was born, so in this case, we're okay on number 1.
Jesus would have known this prophecy. So if he's trying to proclaim himself as the Messiah, do you think by the time he's 33, 3 decades removed from this, he would start telling people that he's from the area of Bethlehem? And later followers who believe this would start telling that as well. The answer is, of course.
Atheist Sean is pointing out that this prophecy can fail on point number 6. People are actively attempting to fulfill it, albeit by Jesus lying in this explanation. That's a strange detail to include, but we'll come back to that.
So I would need some actual proof that he's from that area and didn't invent this like he did other prophecies to believe it's really supernatural.
And hitting number 4, that we can't really verify that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. All we have are the claims of the gospel writers that he was. Even if we accept the gospels at face value, we don't ever have Jesus himself claiming to be from Bethlehem, as atheist Sean seems to be positing. And the gospel writers were explicit in their purpose of trying to connect as many Old Testament prophecies as possible to Jesus. So we should be even more suspicious of their bias.
You have people writing the New Testament, reading back on the Old Testament, pulling things out of context, like the virgin birth. If you actually read Isaiah 7 on the virgin birth, it has nothing to do with the Messiah.
This hits back to criteria number 2. It doesn't seem to be intended as a prediction.
And the Hebrew word is for a young girl, not even a virgin.
That's correct. For those interested, I have a few videos about the Hebrew word Alma as used here.
And the New Testament writers apply that as if to Jesus when it was never implied that way in the Old Testament.
Correct.
Or people like Jesus intentionally try to fulfill him because they're aware of him, and he's trying to convince people he's the Messiah.
I was curious why atheist Sean was attributing the fulfillment effort to Jesus, rather than to the later Christians and gospel writers, as most scholars would posit. But his later self-rebuttal explained the atypical claim.
And my response was to say, well, wasn't Jesus aware of the Old Testament? Couldn't he have just concocted his life and the story about him as if he was born there without giving any evidence? I want to think about this for a minute. What would that make Jesus? That would make Jesus a liar. That he intentionally lied about where he was born to concoct a spiritual story, to mislead people about their eternal fates. I've heard a lot of criticisms of Jesus, but to say he was lying and immoral and evil is a tough pill to swallow.
Christian Sean wants atheist Sean to call Jesus a liar, which is offensive to current Christians. Of course, I would have no problem accusing Jesus of deception if I had to, but I don't have to in this case. As noted, the Jesus of the gospel makes no claim to be from Bethlehem. Those narratives arrive later from the authors of Matthew and Luke only, not in Jesus' voice, and not appearing at all in Mark, the first gospel. Christian Sean is also assuming that an atheist would accept that the Gospels accurately record the words of Jesus. But at the same time, atheist Sean wasn't even sure if historical Jesus exists. So there would be no need to call a legendary figure a liar.
I think a case can be made that he has given us the greatest moral teaching in the history of the world.
That's entirely debatable. The do unto others golden rule is the best thing that Jesus said. And that basic expression of the principle of empathy can be found in religious literature far before Jesus, including the Egyptian goddess Mat from 2000 BC, Thales of Greece from 600 BC, the Indian Mahabharata from 400 BC, Persian Zoroastrianism of 300 BC, and so on and so on.
But second, we actually have good reason to believe Jesus was really born in Bethlehem. The Gospel of Luke records this early on in the early chapters. That's the first century.
It doesn't really matter if it's in the first chapter or the last chapter. Luke was written at least 60 years after the alleged time of the birth event it describes. It also conflicts with the timing described in Matthew and the historical records of the time, but we'll save that for another video.
In the second century, Justin Martyr reports details that line up with Luke about Jesus being born in a cave.
Luke doesn't say that Jesus was born in a cave. That detail doesn't line up.
In the third century, Origen says both friends and foes agree on the birthplace of Jesus.
Yes, by 200 years later, entrepreneurs in the now famous town of Bethlehem had set up a place for religious pilgrims to go and spend their tourism dollars.
And then you get in the 4th century, and Constantine then builds a church over the place that it was said was largely known and believed.
Yes, after Emperor Constantine became a Christian, he sent his mother out to establish churches on holy sites. The local businessmen already cashing in would definitely have welcomed the state funding and official veneration.
So we have a chain of custody going back.
No, what you have is tradition. This isn't confirmation of the event, but rather an extension of enthusiastic followers attempting to fulfill a prophecy on Jesus' behalf.
As we've seen rather consistently now, when you're actually a Christian, fully separating yourself from all those beliefs in order to reason and speak like an atheist is a nearly impossible task. Now, as this Q&A went on for nearly an hour, there's plenty more to this that we won't address for the sake of time. We'll revisit some points Paul and I made in this portion of the video, but for now, let's move on to Sean's true identity reveal.
So I'm going to take the last 15 minutes and tell you about what I really do. I'm not a philosophy professor. I'm not an atheist. I'm not an atheist. I actually teach at a Christian university in Southern California. I do this a lot at different schools. Usually I set people up and let them know I'm a Christian first. We're like, let's just see what happens if we set them up and make them think that I'm an atheist first, see if that changes the nature of the dynamic. I want to make you think about a few things, all right? First off, don't answer this. Why don't you reflect in your heart a little bit, just personally? As a whole, how do you think you treated your atheist guests? There's probably a mix. I hear somebody shout out terribly. Okay. Now, I've done this, youth groups of 12 students. I did this at a church in the Philippines with 8,000 students. And I think that was too many, actually, come to think of it. And your response was pretty typical. In fact, a few of you, I was actually encouraged, tried to be like, hey, thanks for coming. Tried to be like, how do I ask this question in a cordial fashion, which I like. Okay? Here's the deal. The more I do this with people, here's how I find Christians respond. How many of you felt like maybe you're a little bit defensive, a little bit testy, a little bit upset? If you couldn't see it, I could see it in a lot of your eyes, by the way. Some of you are like, I'm ready for this guy to leave, which is okay. Here's one reason why I'm convinced we get a little bit defensive. Part of it is if we don't know what we believe and why we believe it, and somebody starts challenging us, what happens? We get defensive, right? We get upset. Do you understand why knowing what you believe is so important? Then we don't get threatened when people challenge our ideas. If somebody challenges my ideas, I don't get defensive. At least I try not to get defensive, because I know why I think Christianity is true. I've thought about it, and I think there's good answers for it. You see, I'm a Christian for one reason alone. It's not because it makes me feel good. It's not because my parents are Christians. It's not because I teach at a Christian school. I'm a Christian because I actually think it's true. I actually think Christianity is true and best explains reality. If I didn't think it were true, I would give it up. So I think you should only be a Christian if you actually think that it's true. That's the best reason to be a Christian.
So, Sean says not only that he's a Christian solely because he actually thinks it's true, but also that he thinks that's the only reason anyone should be a Christian. If you take actually believing it's true to mean the purely intellectual conviction that it's true, as I think Sean intends, that's commendable. Sean and I are on the same page about that. Sean also said that he did not aim to misrepresent atheists in this dialogue, which is great. However, I don't think Sean's approach here stood by those principles and intentions very well, or at least not as well as the alternative approach, which I'll recommend later on. Allow me to explain why those principles and intentions are inconsistent with this approach. First off, since Sean is a Christian who spoke to these students with the objective of strengthening their faith, atheist Sean only answered questions in a way which Christian Sean could readily counter. After all, as I said, if his atheist character could actually stump his Christian self, Sean might just be an atheist. This guarantees a one-sided discussion in favor of Christianity in events like these. Sean can be sure that the students won't be exposed to any ideas which he can't readily defeat. If he thinks it's really best to challenge one's faith and even to give it up if it's shown to be lacking, why only expose students to a dialogue with an atheist that Sean can completely control? Further, Sean admitted that he purposely had his atheist character confuse students with a sciencey word salad, and that he gave an answer which he thought represented a dishonest atheist. Was Sean trying to paint atheists, even those with the academic distinction of his atheist character, as dishonest and prone to such cheap rhetorical tactics? While I can't speak on Sean's intentions beyond what he himself stated, this is part of the message Sean conveyed to these students. If an atheist doesn't have an answer to your question, they'll lie or try to confuse you. While atheists are just as capable of dishonesty and deception as any other group, this gives these young students a negative impression of atheists based purely on a manufactured example of our lack of character. Like I said, I have a solution to these issues, but I have one more section of Sean's video to address before I do that. Here, Sean discusses a time he role-played as an atheist at a Christian camp. As I discuss this, we should acknowledge the societal context in which all of this is taking place. This high school is in the southern US, which is an area culturally dominated by conservative, usually Protestant, and in some places evangelical Christianity. The southern US is also where I grew up, where I live currently, and where most of my experiences of interactions between Christians and atheists have taken place. This is a place where atheists are a minority who often experience marginalization, given that our families, neighbors, teachers, bosses, and elected officials are often conservative Christians who tend to have uninformed and extremely negative views of atheists. Too often, entire families turn on their atheist loved ones here. Sometimes we get illegally fired from our jobs for not believing in God and nothing is done about it. This is not Western Europe. For a lot of us, it sucks to be an atheist here.
Well, when it was done, students surrounded me for a while because they had a ton of questions, and this girl waited till everybody was gone. And she came up to the front. She was 17 years old, she told me. And she goes, thank you for doing your best to defend atheism. I was like, sure, why are you thanking me? She goes, well, I'm an atheist. I said, really? You're at a Christian camp? That's great you're here. How did you get here? She said, well, I am a leader in my youth group. I said, I feel like I'm missing something here. She said, I grew up in the church. I can't remember if she went to Christian school or not, Christian family. I've been told this stuff my whole life. I started to realize I have questions, and my parents and family, they just deflected my questions. I started to realize I don't believe this anymore. I said, well, have you told anyone? She said, you're the first person I've told. I said, why haven't you told anyone else? And I'll never forget what she said. She said, because I'm afraid they'll treat me like they just treated you. And I was like, oh my goodness. I don't think we realize as Christians, the stories we tell, the attitudes we have, the jokes we laugh at, what it often communicates to people who are not believers. So I just want you to reflect upon this. I have no stake in this game. Maybe you don't believe in God, but if you were not a believer in God and you're watching this, what would your impression of Christians be? That's worth asking. Christians are thoughtful, they're patient, they're gracious, they love atheists, or would it be something else?
To many of my viewers, hearing a Christian apologist actually acknowledge the pain an atheist has had to endure because of the behavior of Christians is probably shocking. For me, this is a first. Never have I heard an apologist, which I don't know personally, even allude to the idea that atheists might struggle to be open or feel belittled or even hated because of how Christians treat them. In fact, when I've brought up these issues from my platform, those in apologetic circles have more often than not laid the blame of atheists' poor treatment in real life at our feet, citing mean anonymous YouTube comments, or accused me of playing the victim for attention. While I don't think apologists are trying to be hateful, their lack of consideration for how Christians often treat atheists and how that leads to trauma for many of us in our personal lives is woefully apparent. That lack of consideration for, or even denial of, our experiences can certainly feel like hatred. Like the girl in Sean's story, when I became an atheist in a Christian community, I didn't tell anyone for over a year, and when I finally did, it started a series of pretty bad experiences. I was bullied as a kid for being short and kind of nerdy, but none of that compared to the treatment I received as an adult after I came out as an atheist in my Christian community. However, because the treatment I received was nowhere near as bad as many other atheists I came to know, I decided to speak out on this publicly in hopes of showing other atheists that they're not alone and they're not crazy. After being an atheist activist for several years now, one of the most common private messages I receive is still an atheist viewer's account of mistreatment or even serious abuse from Christian family. The fact that this is the first time I've ever seen an apologist publicly acknowledge what I'd consider to be one of the most crucial factors in the ongoing dialogue between Christians and atheists is sad. That said, Sean, thank you for bringing this up. For many atheists, especially those like myself or any closeted atheists in your audience who may have come from a discriminatory Christian community, a truly productive dialogue often starts with the acknowledgement that the treatment we're accustomed to receiving is not acceptable. It's clear that addressing this was one of your objectives from the outset, and I appreciate that. Sean expressed 3 objectives for this event: to represent atheists honestly and accurately, to challenge his audience to believe and defend Christianity only because it's intellectually convinced them, and to encourage Christians to engage atheists in kindness and love, not harsh defensiveness. Those are commendable objectives, and I have a suggestion that would help Sean meet them far better than he did here. Sean, when you're having your audience dialogue with an atheist, bring in an actual atheist rather than role-playing as, or even impersonating one. Misrepresentation and even representation of atheists as dishonest did happen here. The atheist answers given were also limited to those which Sean had prepared to discredit. If a real atheist were brought in, Sean wouldn't have to worry about misrepresentation on his part. The answers given might be different than those Sean could give role-playing, providing a better challenge to both Sean and the audience. It would also give the audience the opportunity to gain experience interacting with a real atheist. Sean could stand by to model and maintain civility. I'm sure he'd be great at it. And then make his points about treating atheists with love at the end. Having an actual atheist present would humanize atheists for the audience, making Sean's point even more strongly. It would be a bit more of a logistical challenge for Sean to do this, but it's the right thing to do for this reason. The mistreatment and discrimination that atheists face from some Christians is perpetuated by the fact that the majority of conversations those Christians have about atheists happen without atheists present. The misguided beliefs that Christians use to mock their atheist peers, like that atheists think everything just popped into existence from nothing one day, continue to exist because atheists aren't present when Christians discuss those beliefs in apologetics class. The picture of an atheist as someone who just decides not to believe in God one day because they want to have sex before marriage, which Christian parents often assume of their adult children while refusing to be corrected, continues to exist because Christians discuss it amongst themselves without atheists present to fact-check it. The name-calling and hateful jokes continue with atheists present because many Christians mostly tell those jokes and use those names in conversation with each other when atheists aren't present. So, Sean, for the sake of reaching your own goals, including improving the discourse and relations between Christians and atheists, I ask you to do this one thing. Allow atheists to be present in this discussion and to represent ourselves in these dialogues. Let us make our own mistakes and give our own answers. Most importantly, let us show our humanity to those who see us as pitiful or threatening. Other Christians look up to you, and modeling this behavior for others might just help atheists and Christians begin healing the broken hearts and broken relationships which have resulted from atheists being left out of the conversation. With that, thank you to Apologia for joining me in this video. Paul's channel is so criminally underrated that I can't urge you strongly enough to check out his content. He's got hundreds of excellent responses to Christian claims, especially those of popular apologists, on his channel already, and there's a reason many of those apologists end up defending their claims in reference to Paul's videos specifically. The guy's got talent, you've got to hand it to him. His channel is linked in the description. Go watch a few of those responses, and if you still don't feel like subscribing after that, it sounds like you've got really poor taste. Alright, thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe and follow me on social media at the handles below. As always, if you're an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.